This is the Black Power Chronicles interview of Bob Brown. Bob Brown recently celebrated 50 years of work, study, and struggle in the student and youth, human and civil rights, African liberation, Black Power, and Pan-African, the socialist, anti-war, and anti-draft, anti-Zionist, and anti-repression movements. He was a member of the Chicago chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality, director of the Midwest Office of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and co-founder of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. He has worked with and supported hundreds of progressive and revolutionary movements, organizations, and governments in every corner of Africa, the African diaspora, and the world. And he is currently an organizer for the All-African People's Revolutionary Party and a member of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania and co-director of the Kwame Ture Institute. Thank you, Bob, for joining us today.
Thank you.
We want to begin by talking about some of your earliest influences in coming into consciousness of not only the black predicament in the world, but how you went about trying to change and join movements that would address it. How did your early influences come about?
Well, I was fortunate. I'm one of the so-called baby boomers. And if you look at the progression of the age progression of the baby boomers from at least 46, 47, 48, you will see that as we aged, especially in the city of Chicago, there were crises. By 1953, when we went to high school, when we went to elementary school, there was crisis because they had not built schools and trained teachers since the 30s in the city of Chicago. And you now have this massive demographic wave of 5-year-olds going into kindergarten and elementary school. Chicago had a neighborhood school systems, so they gerrymandered the districts to keep us out. People talk about the struggle of segregation and the struggle for integration in the South, but they don't mention nothing about the struggle at the same time in the North. This Southern approach to African history in the United States, which I totally disagree with. You know, the movements were simultaneous. For example, they gerrymandered in the district of Chicago, the area of Chicago where I live, the far south side, that didn't have sewage, didn't have running water, you know, toilets froze up in the wintertime. They gerrymandered, and they just couldn't figure out how to make the line wiggly enough, so they had to permit a few of us to attend the all-white elementary school, Esmond, and the all-white high school, reluctantly. But even though legally they were compelled to let us in the door, it was still segregated. For example, my high school in the 1930s, 1,700 white kids boycotted Morgan Park High School in the 1930s because they dared to permit 1 or 2 African kids into the school. And they had to bring Frank Sinatra to sing to the white folks, the angry white folks, to get them to accept African people. 20 or 30 years ago, while it was integrated, physically in terms of attendance, it was not integrated. My mother and father went to the high school, and there were problems then. By the time I got to the high school in 1960, we had a black football team, but we couldn't have a black cheerleader. We couldn't have African on the newspaper. We couldn't do certain kinds of things. It was still segregated, although it was considered to be one of the best high schools in the city of Chicago. Originally, it was to be the University of Chicago. Wow. Before they annexed Beverly Hills and Evergreen Park to the city of Chicago. Rockefeller owned the land. He was going to build the University of Chicago there. So technically, anybody who got good grades at Morgan Park High School almost had a free ticket to the University of Chicago. And certainly if you played good basketball or football, like Bear, you know, who was the star, you know, he thought he was on his way straight ticket to Gale Sayers in Kansas and whatnot. So there were perks. But the racism was very clear. My mother was a maid for 50 years She cleaned 3 and 4 houses a day, 6 days a week. I mean, rich white folk houses. My father was a garbage man. One of the first ones to drive the garbage, African to drive the garbage trucks in the city of Chicago. And he was Teamsters. Didn't have the problem like in Memphis, Tennessee, where garbage people could not be unionized. He was Teamsters. I'm a Teamster baby.
Okay.
And Teamsters ain't struck but once or twice in my life in the city of Chicago because they don't play. So you had all of these issues and problems just socially and whatnot in a poor family with 13 kids. You know, my mother, my father, and 13 kids. But I was very lucky because as I came of political age, there were movements in the streets. For example, when I was 7 years old, Emmett Till was murdered. And anybody knows the history of Chicago, they know that the murder of Emmett Till in 1955 was a major. He was born in Mississippi, but he was raised in Chicago. Sammy Rayner took the hearse from the Rayner Funeral Parlor down to Moni, Mississippi to bring the body back, and his mother made me let him leave it open. I was too young to go, but it was in all the newspapers, on all the TVs. You couldn't avoid it in the city of Chicago. So that certainly was an awakening because you knew that if you went south, and you really didn't have to go south, just go 5 blocks up the street.
Right.
You know, you had to fight.
Right.
If you went that way to the grocery store or that way to the movie theater, because we were hemmed in with Irish, rich Irish on that side and European ethnic on that side. And you had to fight. As the border, the dividing line between the African and the white community shifted, I mean, they were that side of Vincennes. But when the Finizzo brothers built 4 houses and sold them to African people on that side of Vincennes, the line shifted to the alley. And when you go out to take the garbage out, white kids, African kids throwing bricks at each other and whatnot in terms of the dividing lines. This area is now the epicenter of some of the gang violence and stuff. My family moved from Mississippi, Louisiana, and helped pioneer and settle it. But if you remember a couple of years ago, some kids, so-called Augill Gardens, where Obama lied and said he organized in the 80s. The Black Panther Party had the largest chapter in Augill Gardens led by Leroy Patterson in 1968. And the conditions of the people in Augill Gardens had not changed for the better in 50 years. Well, they merged 2 high schools, knowing full well 2 rival gangs. The gang in Roseland, the gang in Augill. And they pushed the kids from Augill to go to school across the street from my sister and brother-in-law's house. And every day when the school closed, there is struggles between the gangs because you're forcing them together. And you saw the spectacle of kids beating each other to death with 2x4s. That's right in the community where I grew up. You know, so you have these problems. By 1963, the elementary schools were on double and triple shifts because there were so many African kids that did not have enough classrooms. So they brought trailers, which were called Willis wagons. That's what they were called. And there was a struggle led by our parents and whatnot for quality education, for integrated education, for better education. It just moved. As we aged and went from grade to grade and school to school, it merged. People don't know that Kwame Ture integrated schools in New York City. Coming from an all-African environment in Trinidad, in the public schools, by the time he got to New York and moved into the Brooklyn or the Bronx, until Howard University, From 1952, when he came into the country, till 1960, he was in at least 3 schools. He integrated all of them. All of them. Some people know it, but to them it's not a major factor, because they have this myth that Brown versus Board of Education 1954 only impacted schools in the South, D.C. South, and that's a lie. Schools in Chicago and New York City are still segregated today. And some of the major so-called civil rights struggles coming out of Brown and Board of Education since 1954 occurred in the South. But you also had the Democratic Party Mayor Daley regime. Yes. I grew up fighting the Democratic Party and fighting the Daley machine. One of my first acts in the movement, my mother's cousin Earl Mosley, who was lifetime NAACP and lifetime supporter for Jesse Jackson, during the summer of 1963 and 1964, Earl and I stood in front of Mayor Daley Sr.'s house with picket signs, with 2x4s, because we had to fight. We smacked Daley Jr. 1 or 2 times with them 2x4s. As they were running out to go up the street to the White Sox ballpark, which was a few, blocks from old man Daley's house. But 11 or 12 o'clock every Sunday for the entire summer, Earl and I were standing in front of Mayor Daley's house on 35th and Low with 2 picket signs, 1 in each hand. On the front side said, "Dump Daley." On the back side said, "Dump Dawson."
How old were you during that time?
I was 15.
Okay. And why was the Chicago machine of politics so important to resist? What was its nature, and why did it influence your early movement?
Because it was corrupt, it was racist, and it was vicious, even with a velvet glove. 50 years later, I'm still fighting to dump the Daley machine, symbolized by Rahm Emanuel, even though they purport to not speak to each other and have a problem. And I'm fighting to dump Bobby Rush, who inherited the Daley machine.
Would you say that the machine was continuous, or were there people who were elected in Chicago?
All living organisms must bring new blood. The Daley machine has an infinite capacity to co-opt and to pimp and to hustle and use. When we struggled to build the Black Panther Party, I wasn't trying to feed no kids. I wasn't talking about social service programs. In fact, Mayor Daley had more and better social programs than the Black Panther Party did. I was fighting to build an independent, all-African political party that would crush the Democratic Party machine in Chicago. Somehow, some people changed. The Democratic machine has not changed. It has simply changed names and changed, in some instances, colors. All due respect to my brother Bobby Rush, but the conditions of the masses of African people in the 2nd Congressional District tonight are not any better during his reign than it was during Dawson's.
So you were able at 15 to see how even black visibility in the machine didn't have any material benefit to the black community.
First of all, in order to get a job, you had to work for the Democratic Party. You had to vote for the Democratic Party. My father refused. For example, when John F. Kennedy was killed, my father was at the bar with his buddies, his garbage brothers and whatnot, and somebody came up to him and said, they just killed John F. Kennedy. He said, "One more cracker dead." They laid him off. Supervisor heard it, took it back to Mayor Daley, laid him off.
Wow.
It was one of the hungriest periods in my life. I always fought the Democratic Party, and I will continue to fight the Democratic Party. I don't care who joins it. I'm not in it.
So this idea that all black people valorize JFK is not really true.
No, it's not true. It's not true. JFK had no interest in us. JFK financed the civil rights movement. JFK owned and controlled SNCC. I can document it. This myth that SNCC was anti-old people, was totally a youth movement, totally independent of elderly people, is a lie. John F. Kennedy paid for it.
And his interests are obvious because they needed the votes.
They needed the votes in the South because the Southern racist white folks did not want to vote for a Catholic. So in order to, he narrowly won.
Right.
He narrowly won the race. In fact, it is Chicago who delivered the votes. He made the phone call to Coretta Scott King when Dr. King was in jail, and Louis Martin and the Democratic Party machine in Chicago flooded the churches that sad Sunday before the vote, and it delivered. We put him there, and he fully knew that he would not be reelected. He would not be reelected unless they registered us to vote. So this notion that he did this for some noble, non-selfish is a lie. Lyndon Baines Johnson financed and controlled the civil rights movement. He paid the bills for Mississippi Summer Project.
So how do you situate his interest, particularly his pushing of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act?
Same interest. The South revolted in 1948 for the Democratic Party with Strom Thurmond
the Dixiecrats.
and the Dixiecrats. And he was part of that.
Right.
And he was caught between the northern so-called liberal wing of the party and the southern so-called Dixiecrat wing. And Malcolm X was clear, the two wings on the same bird.
Got Hubert Humphrey and then Richard Russell.
Yes. So he had to maneuver. He fully well knew that the 1948 revolt that the Democratic Party had matured by 1964. He knew Goldwater was going to sweep the South. He knew that. You know, he knew that if he went, he said, if he supports the Voting Rights Act of 65, they will lose the South for a generation. He said it.
He said it.
In fact, it's been 2 generations, if not 3. Because the South has not voted Democratic since 1964. They knew from Reconstruction, you know, that if the Republican Party fights for the right to vote, the Democratic Party is on the other side. The Democratic Party, a Republican Party, used us to put Lincoln in the White House. It wasn't about no free and no slave. It was about which way the railroads was going to roll. That is why it is no accident tonight that all 6 major railroads roll through Chicago. Because when the South succeeded, that was the end of the railroad going through, the transcontinental railroad going through St. Louis or New Orleans. Because Lincoln was a railroad lawyer. He worked for the Union Pacific Railroad. Wasn't about freeing us.
No accident that after the Civil War,
no accident,
to the expansion of the railroad system.
No accident. And the banks and the industries and other stuff and whatnot. So it's just we're not told the truth. So you had all these struggles. The city of Chicago, the movements, were in the streets. And they have been in the streets consistently for almost 60 years. Ups and downs in terms of mass participation, ups and downs in terms of the quality of the leadership or the treachery of the leadership. It is nothing new. My second political act, in 1963, Chicago took tens of thousands of people on the railroads from Chicago to the March on Washington. Children were not allowed to go. One, because you couldn't take underage children across the state lines. 2, because grown-ups did what grown-ups were going to do on a train ride. So I was not permitted. My parents wouldn't let me go. But they don't talk the true history. Malcolm X said the masses of people were in the streets coming to Washington, D.C. And the Big Six got ahead of it and sold it out to Johnson and the Ford Foundation and Walter Reuther and all that kind of stuff. But he wasn't, he didn't go far enough. It was not just the masses of the people in the street, it was the masses of youth. 1960 is considered to be a turning point because college students took to the streets. Tens of thousands arrested in 1960 and 61 with the student sit-in movement. But what they don't talk about is 1963 was the year of the high school and elementary school students worldwide. Between May of 63 or so with the Birmingham Campaign and the Children's Crusade, the Birmingham Campaign failed. King had made one small strategic miscalculation. He said fill the jails. The campaign was about filling the jails, which is good for a nonviolent pacifist campaign. But he miscalculated. He counted the traditional jails. He didn't count Greyhound. He didn't count the Little League basket chaining people under the bleachers in the Little League field. He undercounted, he underestimated Bull Counter's ability to get non-traditional jail cells. He overestimated the capacity, the willingness of adult people to go to jail. At that time, except among certain groups in the North, going to jail was not good. It gave you a stigma for the rest of your life and whatnot. So it wasn't like a lot of people, except with that culture, talking about going to jail. So he could not find enough adults to go to jail. These two strategic miscalculations almost crushed the Birmingham Campaign. But Jim Bevel and Diane Nash went up into 3 high schools and thousands of youth poured out in the streets. It is the youth who saved the Birmingham Campaign. And if they had not done that, you would have never heard of Martin Luther King, and I love him and I respect him. Malcolm X, I love him. But Malcolm X made a profound error.
What's that?
He called Dr. King a punk, not a man, because men do not put women and children in the picket lines and in the streets. He did that. And he made an error. I'm not a member of the Nation of Islam. My mother and father couldn't stop me from joining the movement. How the hell is Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X going to do that? The children of the Nation of Islam have never marched, yet they're in line to get the affirmative action. They need to be careful. They did not fight for these gains. We did. We did. And not just in the United States. In April of 1963, a PAC, a Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania leader, Patleko Labelo, in Botswana, gave a press conference saying they had crushed PAC, they had crushed Mandela, they had banned them, all of that, from 61. Mandela was in jail, you name it. Labelo makes a statement that they had rebuilt POCO, the PAC guerrilla army, and there were the wings of the army was in every high school and every elementary school across South Africa. That is true. That is true. But when he made that statement, the South African police arrested more than 3,000 Azanian high school kids and whatnot, including Steve Biko's older brother, who spent several months in jail. There's a cadre of PAC people who were high school students. Over 300 of them were sent to Robben Island. They broke rocks. They built the cell that Mandela slept in. They were on Robben Island fighting when Mandela came. They would work all day in the rock field and then illegally play soccer in their cells at night. You can go on the internet and you can see a movie about it. More than just a game, which FIFA Cup commissioned to be made in celebration of South Africa having the games. Mark Shinnis, he's alive, he's working today. I stay with him when I go. We're about the same age. You had students in South Africa, you had students and youth in every corner of the world in the streets.
So this represents that independent black political activity that you were gesturing to?
I don't know that it was independent.
Okay.
I don't accept that myth.
Okay.
There's no such thing as pure independence.
Okay.
From 1954 to 1963, our parents had us in the streets. Fighting, I said it, fighting for quality educating, fighting for this, fighting for that. The main structures that did that were, first of all, the NAACP, secondly, CORE, and then after 1960, STIC. So we were participating in boycotts. We were doing all of that because our parents occasionally told us to do that. By 63, we're now 15. So we now think we're old enough, grown enough to make some of our own decisions. You understand?
Yes.
But how can you say it was independent? How can you say a child is independent of the family?
Gotcha.
May think she is. Who paying the rent? Who feeding them? You know, so this notion of independence, I have a problem with it. The children who the NAACP put in the streets against those Willis wagons from 55 through 63 through our parents and the community organizations, we took to the streets in 63. The high school kids of 63 were the college students of 68, or the military in Vietnam, or the gangs in the streets. And we knew each other. We knew each other, and we still know each other. So there is waves. I think you raised what is the turning points? What are the milestones in different sectors of the movement? You must certainly say birth is a milestone. So you had 27 million, or 20 or 27 million baby boomers in the United States born between 46 and 64. That's the main cohort for a baby boomer, sociologically speaking. So you must put 46 as a milestone. You know, 1 year, whatever, after the conclusion of World War II, and massive numbers of babies born all over the world, not just in the United States. Well, by the time they hit 5, that's a milestone. Is it an accident that when a kid born in 1946 becomes 5 in 1951, 52? Is it an accident that all of a sudden there's a Supreme Court decision against desegregation in the schools? I don't think so. I don't think it's an accident. 54, 55 with the Montgomery bus boycott, 55 with Emmett Till, you know, the Southern rebellion against, I don't think these are accidents. I don't believe in conspiracy theories either. I believe that when you bottle steam in a kettle, unless you let some of the steam off in a controlled way, it explodes.
As well, independence movements across the world.
All across the world. And not just in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia. I don't think it accident, Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This comes out of years of struggle. Years of struggle. I don't think it's an accident. The French atomic tests in Algeria in 1959 to threaten, to scare the NLF, Ben Bella, Frantz Fanon. I don't think it represents a milestone. It represents a point at which the movement reaches critical mass.
So we really can't talk about Black Power unless we go back to that moment.
And before that. I don't think it's an accident that Kwame Nkrumah born in 1909, Sekou Touré born in 1927, Kwame Touré born in 1941. This represents 3 generations. Some sociologists take a generational approach to history. Certainly, who was it? I forget. Fanon or somebody said each generation out of relative obscurity must find its mission, fulfill it, or betray it.
Yes.
That's a generational approach to history. It is not adequate for the statement, is correct, but it is not adequate for today because generations are not monolithic. Generations like organizations, like individuals have good and bad.
Sure.
A traitor, conscious.
Different missions.
A snitch, conscious, has found their mission. So it doesn't have a class character. The statement doesn't have a class character to it. It's not clear enough because you debate and you argue over what is the mission in life. And some people confuse tactics with strategy and strategy with values and principles. So while his statement is correct, he didn't tell us how to do it. And those conflicts continue to exist today.
Were you thinking about class in those terms in the 60s when you were young, in terms of age? How did you...
Very simple.
How did you all struggle with that?
No, very simple.
Yeah.
We were the children of garbage men and maids. Going to school with the children of rich people. How could you not know race and class? You did not necessarily have a full understanding consciously, but you knew the difference. You knew the difference when your mother bring hand-me-down clothes and hand-me-down toys that the white kids break and throw away. You know the difference when your mother's out helping with their Christmas party and not at yours. So, no, we didn't have a full understanding. But yes, I understood race and class very quickly. But even more than that, by 1964, I was reading Marxist literature. They had killed Patrice Lumumba. And I had heard that the Russians had printed a book called Lumumba's Last Will and Testament. And I had been told that there was only one store in Chicago that sold it, the Communist Party's bookstore. So I cut white folks' grass. I will not have grass today. I cut too much grass and I shovel too much snow. I ain't doing it. I ain't doing it. Promised myself a long time ago, not me. I went to Ishmael's bookstore in 1964 and I asked for the book. He said, yes, he has the book. But he told me, I will give you this book for free if you buy this Marxist book. I said, well, let's make a deal. I'll buy the Lumumba book. You give me that and I will read it. By the time I left the store, I had two shopping bags full of books.
Wow.
And I still got them. You know, so it didn't take long. In 1963 in Chicago, you had a wave of high school and student struggles and rebellions. From April of 63 and maybe earlier to at least October, November of 63. And it is this mass youth ferment, not just high school, not just college, because the college movement from the 1960-61 was waning. It picked up again in 64 and whatnot, but it was waning. And they were now seniors and on their way out the door. And we were juniors and seniors and sophomores in high school on our way to whatever path we chose after the end of high school. You understand? In October 22nd, I believe it was, 1963, 250,000 high school and elementary school students in Chicago boycotted school for one day. 250,000. They talk about 250,000 at the March on Washington, but nobody talks. They talk about the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, Alabama, but nobody talks about the high school boycott, elementary school boycott organized by Larry Landry, who at that moment was the director of the Chicago SNCC office. They don't talk about that. It is that boycott of 63 which took over 5 years or more to build. Wasn't no spontaneous. It took time to build. That mass boycotts erupted in all the major cities in the North within 63, 64. Nobody has written about that. It is that was the breeding ground for the cadre. You name any structure that has former youth in it today, you can point it to that year. That is the year the gangs started going over to the mass in the city of Chicago. And David Barksdale and Larry Hoover and Jeff Ford and Pepperlo and Jamie Doc Brown. They're a little older. They're older than me. But by that time, they were 15, 16, 17, and they had chosen their career path. Within 2 years or so, that's the point at which the Vietnam War was moving over. You know, by 64, there was only 16,000 U.S. troops. By 66, 67, there was almost 500,000. It was moving. It also coincides with the aging of the baby boomers. 18, draftable.
So it naturally segues into the anti-war movement.
And if you trace the origins of anybody in the movement who've been in the movement for several years, for several decades, you will chase them back to the 63, 64 period. Mario Salvo and the free speech movement. You know, the youth who were in Mississippi and Alabama and whatnot, who are now in their 50s and 60s and 70s. You know, so that's a period, the 63, 64. The movement clearly split. It split in 1961 inside of SNCC between those who said voter registration and those who said demonstrations. And that split still exists today.
Why do you think there was a split? Was it around class, ideology?
It was around tactic. Both sides said they wanted to be free. They wanted the right, they wanted to vote. But it was around several things. It was not simply around class, because there were petty bourgeois and middle class people on both sides of the divide. It was philosophical. Those forces who ultimately adopted pacifism as a way of life versus those who saw it as purely a tactic. And that conflict still exists today.
Sure.
I will go up to New York on Friday. We have a program organized by our wing of the Pan-Africanist movement and the A.J. Muslim wing of the peace movement. And it's going to rock it, because we're going to hit all the ideological divides straight up. And we've been debating and arguing that stuff since the 60s and whatnot. It manifests itself today between those who made a decision in 1964 that they wasn't voting for Johnson, that they didn't register people to vote to join the Democratic Party. They did not sell out and compromise when when the leadership compromised at Atlantic City in 1964. Some people crawled back to Mississippi and said, okay, we've been sold out, but we're going to still vote for Lyndon Baines Johnson. And they couldn't even vote. Yet they went out there with mock elections and campaigned. Kwame Ture said no. No, he wasn't supporting the Democratic Party. He wasn't supporting, he worked with them. They paid the bills. But he split with the sellout in Atlantic City with MFDP in 1964.
So that's a huge turning point, 64.
It's a huge turning point.
Okay, the Atlantic City challenge. So
around the question of, first of all, we're not in the system in that sense because we can't vote in the South. We can't register in the South. We voted and we registered in the North. But nobody talks about the bloody struggle to win that right in the North. It's called uneven development. The South had the right to vote Africans in the 1870s.
Right.
When Reconstruction was crushed, the exodus, the first wing of the exodus north was the middle class. The first ones to leave Mississippi and come to Chicago was the businessmen and the politicians. Facts of that. It took 30 years, 50 years for black power, so-called black power inside the system to emerge in Chicago. This nonsense, this is ahistorical nonsense that the 60s represent the second Reconstruction is a lie. It's the third. Chronologically speaking, if one talks about the whole country and all African people, not just some of them, the first Reconstruction was 1865 through 76. The second Reconstruction was the 1920s through the 1940s.
Great Migration.
The Great Migration, but more than that, if you count the end of Reconstruction at the point when Congress people, elected officials were disbarred or thrown out, and we, quote, lost the right to vote, if that is how you define the end of Reconstruction, with the purge of African people from Congress, then to be consistent, the second Reconstruction must start the day African people begin to go back to Congress. So the second Reconstruction must begin in 1928 when Arthur Mitchell and other Africans in Chicago were the first elected officials to return to Congress. And then you had Adam Clayton Powell. How do you wipe Adam Clayton Powell out of history? Yeah, Dawson. Dawson was there for Adam Clayton Powell, and he was no good. Which shows you we ain't talking quality. But if you're consistent and correct, then you must correctly say the second Reconstruction begins in 1928 in Chicago, when Africans were elected as Republicans to go back to Congress. And then Dawson shifted later to Democrats. That represents the third. The one they're talking about chronologically is the third Reconstruction.
That's interesting because you also have in the 20s and the 30s this robust attempt to organize around working class interests. The American Negro Labor Congress, National Negro Congress, Brotherhood of Student Carporters, so on and so forth.
But not just that, because white labor paid for that. A. Philip Randolph ain't organized no sleeping car porters on his own. He was financed by the Socialist Party and other forces.
Right. And
don't forget, the Pullman porters, the Pullman cars were built in Chicago.
Right.
In fact, the community, you got Augier Gardens, you got a community called Roseland, where them kids were beating each other with 2x4s in Chicago. Roseland is where the Pullman cars were built. That's where the cars were built.
But I think the parallel makes sense because you also had, during the 19th century Reconstruction, liberal whites who were investing in the black vote because they see a material interest.
Bottom line, the battle between W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington was over many issues. But one of them was over who would get Andrew Carnegie's money. And Du Bois fought for it as hard, if not harder, than Booker T. did. And up until recently, Carnegie Foundation, Carnegie Endowment, was one of the biggest philanthropic organizations controlling Negro education. Now George Soros is taking over.
Howard University has building names at the Carnegie, so.
You understand? And Ford Foundation really owns Black studies.
Absolutely.
And African studies, and area studies, and international studies. And anybody says any difference need to hand in their PhDs.
True.
They are mouthpieces and apologists. They're not scholars if they reject that fact. George Bundy, who was a civilian architect of the Phoenix program and Vietnamization and all of the Vietnam War under Kennedy and Johnson. He resigned a couple of months before Black Power in 1966. He didn't resign, he was pushed out. He convened a meeting of so-called wise men in the White House who advised Johnson that they were losing the war. And he had to leave. He joined the Ford Foundation as the president. And from 1966, for the next 20 or 30 years, he financed that version of Black Power. He financed the Black Studies program, decided which ones, how much they would get, and who would teach. He financed the election of the Black political forces. He paid for urban renewal in Baltimore, in Cleveland. We can document it. But more importantly, first thing he said is, you can't talk to Kwame Ture. He spent 30 years of his life fighting Kwame. Everything Kwame built, he destroyed. Everybody Kwame tried to recruit, he compromised and he bought. We can't defame on this program, so we won't name them.
So that gets
but they know who they are.
That gets us to the point to talk really about the emergence of Black Power in the public consciousness. You know, it's always been in Black people's consciousness in one way or other, but by 1966, it's in the public's consciousness. What did that do to what was happening on the ground for Black people when that word or that slogan was uttered?
First of all, it is a cancer where academicians and moving people are running around here talking about, I'm the father of Black Power. I'm the father of Black Power studies. I mean, in the 21st century, where's the mama? Where's the mama? It is sick to be talking about the paternity of. It is opportunistic and incorrect.
I agree.
Because people just pick a person, pick a date. So Adam Clayton Powell said Black Power, so Paul Robeson said Negro Power, so this one said that one. And what they do is they selectively choose dates to bolster their own organizational and political perspective. Richard Wright said Black Power, wrote a book, but they don't tell you the book was about Kwame Nkrumah and the Gold Coast Revolution. They leave that out. They put Richard Wright in because he was born in Mississippi. You know, New Africa. But they neglect to put the book was about Kwame Nkrumah. They didn't know until I told them. Frederick Douglass did a speech in 1851, I believe it was, called The Doom of Black Power. And that speech is very important. Number one, because it puts a longer timeline. hear the word Black Power by Frederick Douglass in an 1851 speech. So if you're talking etymology and the genealogy of words and timelines, you must at least go back to 1851. If you can confuse Negro with black, if you are African centered, then you must go back to Egypt. You must go back to Egypt and Nubia, especially those Egyptologists, people who believe in Kemet, who say it was black. Cleopatra black, oh, that's Black Power. She sold out to Anthony. That's Black Power. Because they're doing that today. It is also very important because it shows you the ideological conflict inside the movement, inside the terms. In that point in time, when Frederick Douglass said black, it was seen as negative.
Sure.
When it was re-echoed in '66, it was seen as positive. Coming through the Garvey movement and all these other manifestations who took that word and turned it on his head and made it positive. But Frederick Douglass said it was evil. Frederick Douglass was not talking about black people. He's talking about slavery. The doom of Black Power, the doom of King Cotton. He predicted the destruction of slavery, the destruction of the King Cotton 5 years before or 10 years before the Civil War. But the words of them is important because it shows you the ideological conflict within that movement then and now.
So the words Black Power can be a container for a range of different politics.
It is. Black Power can be evil. That's what Frederick Douglass said. Black Power can mean white people, can mean slave masters. He called the slave master Black Power. Evil power. He was correct. In the sense, if he was correct for that time period, if you see the word black as evil. You cannot suggest that he said the same thing Kwame Ture said, or the same thing Marcus Garvey said. He did not. In fact, he's more closer to Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King wasn't bad, but he didn't really see black in the same way Kwame did. He didn't want to use the word Black Power. He didn't denounce it.
But I'm also thinking about what happens when Nixon's people appropriate it.
Yes.
You know.
Yes. And many of the people who advised Richard J. Nixon to say black capitalism were out of Chicago and St. Louis, black Republicans. I know them personally. One of them was a high school history teacher and coach, and he introduced me to Fred Hampton.
Wow.
He was NAACP Young Turk. And if you wanted to go organize on the high school, in the high schools, you had to have a teacher who would be the advisor to your student group. And we knew who the good teachers, good in the sense that they cared about youth, they spent extra time being an advisor for your little football team, your wrestling team. I mean, they truly love youth. And spent extra time with them, would help you, would mentor you, not just run off, once the paycheck arrives. They advised Nixon to do that. And not all of them, but some of them were out of Chicago. Chicago, Wichita, St. Louis, New York City, Washington, D.C. I know them. And Condoleezza Rice's daddy out of Denver. Bobby Rush's older stepbrother was a Republican, so was his mother. It was normal. It's not a defamation.
Sure.
If you voted, Martin Luther King voted Republican. Adam Clayton Powell voted Republican in 1956 because the Democratic Party has never been our friend. The Democratic Party is a party of slavery. the Republican Party, and now he claims to be our savior. The Republican Party was the party of abolition. And now it's the worst thing God ever produced. Lesser of evil and worse.
But still evil.
Still evil. Who would settle for lesser of evil, lesser of devils, and lesser of gods? And certainly what religious figure would let the word lesser? They preach hell and damnation. If you don't do what they tell you to do and don't put the money in the collection plate, you're going to hell. Every Sunday. And then tell us to vote for the lesser of evil. That's madness.
So what did Kwame Ture mean by Black Power?
Kwame Ture, if you read the book Black Power, the book Black Power is reform. It's not revolution. He said it very clearly. Black Power means the ability to control the sheriff's office, the probate judge, the treasury of Lowndes County. Well, I think we've been controlling. No, let's not say control. I think we've had black faces. He also said in that book that black visibility is not black power. He said it. It's in the book, 1967. So the book itself had many contradictions inside of it. When you read the 25 years afterwards, he says it again. Black visibility is not black power. Black elected officials, blacks on TV, blacks playing ball, blacks singing rap songs, that's visibility. It ain't no power. And if it is power, it's for the individual, for the elite. Because the conditions of the masses of the people, he said it, only had 300 African elected officials in 1967, got more than 10,000 today. And look at the misery. Look at the misery. The proportion of elected officials who are in jail and snitching to keep from going to jail is much higher than the proportion of youth who get caught up in this drug empire. And they can't all scream entrapment. They can't all scheme entrapment. It's greed, it's corruption. And if one, like I say, if you take it from a percentage basis, of the 10,000 African elected officials, how many have gone to jail? Rightly so. I know there are a few who are innocent. But if you take that percentage and you compare the numbers of youth who go to jail for selling drugs, for killing somebody, I will bet you the percentage of elected officials is much higher. And you want to tell me that's black power? I love Marion Barry. Where was black power here? Under Marion Barry or Joyce Lavner, because she was in charge of D.C. on paper after they took Marion down. The control board is love her. No disrespect. How many elected city councilmen have we had in the District of Columbia in the last 40 years? And Columbia is white. This D.C. is whiter tonight than it was 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago.
Were you all aware of those contradictions in the late 60s, early 70s?
In Chicago, we certainly was.
So how did you organize to really move beyond them?
We tried to build. We first of all fought to get independent elected officials. Sammy Rayner, other forces in Chicago, Dick Newhouse. We waged massive campaigns. From 1963, Dick Gregory ran for mayor of Chicago in '64. I voted for him and couldn't even vote. I mean, I didn't vote, I worked for him. I was 16, I couldn't vote. But I was out there campaigning for him in 1964. He lost. Harold Washington lost 1 or 2 times before he made it in '83. We fought. We fought to get progressive, independent, political, elected officials in the city of Chicago, in Cook County, in Illinois. It's a history. And overwhelmingly, we lost. We made a few. But when we saw that having an individual was not enough, we began to struggle to build independent political formations.
Okay. Can you talk about that, those formations?
White folks had liberal independent voters of Illinois and SEPA, Independent Political Action Committee. I mean, they organized to do that. They've been organizing for generations to build communist parties, socialist parties, green parties, independent parties, third parties. There's a whole movement. Okay. We've been doing that too. Okay. And the Panther Party and the MFDP was one experiment. And unfortunately, they were sold out. They were sold out. How can you move from the chairman of the Black Panther Party of Illinois to the vice chairman of the Democratic Party of Illinois? How do you do that? Is that a step forward or a step backwards? Yeah. No, it can't be explained.
Is this one of the reasons that you were attracted to the Pan-African struggle? Or is it
inclusive of... But I was always Pan-African before I told you in 1964 I went to find me a book on Lumumba.
Right. So how does Pan-Africanism then help us clarify those contradictions
the contradictions also exist inside of Pan-Africanism.
Sure.
Can you really say that the OAU, the African Union, is any different than the City Hall in Chicago? Can you really say that Barack Obama was any better than Mobutu or Papa Doc? More sophisticated, for sure. Better? Not for us. So the same contradictions, it's called neocolonialism.
Sure.
It's called corruption, it's called treachery. The contradictions inside of the Pan-African movement, the Black Power movement is part of the Pan-African movement. Right. You can't have Pan-Africanism without power.
And that's what kind of I want you to explore a little bit, because so often the debates and conversations about Black Power get so domesticated that we don't see that these things are happening across the world, that they're impacting African people across the world. It's the same basic struggle.
But it's first of all a line struggle. Some people see Pan-Africanism as one unified continent with unity of African, 550 million African people around the world. Some African people see a decentralized 65 countries in Africa and 100 countries in the African diaspora. Some people see one governmental structure. Some people say 165. We can argue that one is Pan-Africanism and the other is anti-Pan-Africanism, and I certainly do. The AU is not Pan-Africanism. Unless you suggest that lesser of evils and greater of devils is Pan-Africanism. The filth and the corruption. So there is confusion. Some of it unconscious and accidental, some of it deliberate. Those forces who say today that Pan-Africanism is like Zionism is confused. Because Zionism stole somebody else's land and displaced them and occupies the land. That's not liberation. That's not liberation. So those who see Pan-Africanism as similar to Zionism are at best confused. At best, lesser of evils. At best, on the payroll of Zionism. Those people who suggest that Pan-Africanism equals capitalism, that somehow you're going to cut some deals get some money, and buy your way to freedom. Those people who are saying we should get control of our own resources, that's partly true. But when you take control of uranium and of plutonium, who are you going to sell it to? We don't use it. We don't need it. How are you going to take it from white folk and sell it back to white people? Why do we need it? As much water and wind and air as there is in Africa, why do we need nuclear energy or nuclear weapons? So anybody who's talking about taking control of our resources in order to sell it back to the white folks, that ain't about us. That's not about the people. That's about those individuals who simply want to get rich doing the same thing the white folks did. The Pan-African movement must be environmental. You can't take Africa and then destroy the environment, destroy Mother Earth. You cannot say, damn the people who mine their uranium. Somebody's mining that stuff. Somebody's digging that stuff out of the ground. And you are jeopardizing their health. This is not a Pan-Africanism that doesn't speak to environmental questions, doesn't speak to conservation questions in a revolutionary sense. It's nothing. You cannot unite the people by oppressing the people. You can't do that. And you can't unite the people with one or two people sitting up here extremely rich. Go on the website and check the net worth of our leadership. I won't do it. Here, I do it every day. It's a website called Net Worth. Type in the basketball player, type in the hip-hop singer, type in the minister, type in the preacher, type in the lawyer. Just type the name. It'll tell you. How can you do that?
So would you agree that at its core, Black Power, I guess in the manifestation that you received it, was about rethinking the meaning of power?
Black power is dialectical. It is good and bad, and we've always understood that. Since '63 at least. I have, because I said Dunk Daly and Dawson. So I understood that all black power was not good. It's not good. You cannot go into Chicago and tell them people Barack Obama is not black power. I do. I do, and they think I'm insane. What has he done for us?
Yeah.
What has he done for us? You cannot tell me Trump is going to do any worse or any better than Hillary. You've seen what Bill did to Haiti, to Rwanda. What more do we have to see? So black power, Pan-Africanism has good and bad. And it depends upon how it is organized and constructed, which is predominant. What people, go back and look at Kwame's speeches. After 1967, you don't hear him say black power no more. He moved from black power to Pan-Africanism. It took years to move from freedom now and Negro to black power. It took less than 1 year.
What do you think helped him get there?
His world tour, his meeting Fidel Castro, his meeting Ho Chi Minh, his meeting Kwame Nkrumah's secretary, and he wasn't the first. Ho Chi Minh met Garvey, was a member of the UNA. It is Ho Chi Minh who sent Kwame to Africa. He said, when you people in Africa go home. And Kwame had not thought about it. and he went home. He went home. Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad met Kwame Nkrumah, Secretary, and NASA and other forces before Kwame Ture. 64 was not Malcolm X's first trip to Africa. He was on the committee in New York City to meet Africans when they came to the UN. He met Nkrumah in '59, Secretary and other forces. The difference is that he had access to them, but he didn't agree with them. Didn't agree with them.
Not at that time. He was coming to agree.
No, I believe we over-exaggerate his development. I love him. But now remember, he only lived 14 months after he left the Nation of Islam. And I mean, how much can you really learn? How much can you really do in 14 months? I mean, I'm not denouncing him, sure, but we need to stop this over-exaggeration. We need to stop it. How much can you do? How much can you learn? How much can you really know? Yes, you can be in motion. And you could reach certain milestones, certain points and whatnot. But to say he was fully a Pan-Africanist, to say he was a socialist, he was moving perhaps that way. But who knows what he would have been if he's still alive today. We don't have those crystal balls. And we need to be a bit more careful. Only the gods do not make mistakes, and I kind of wonder where God was at with slavery, and where God was at with Hitler. I kind of wonder.
Were there others involved in the movement that were going along the road with Kwame Ture towards Pan-Africanism?
Yes.
And if so, who were some of those folks, and what did they end up doing?
I don't want to name names.
Okay, so generally.
Because if I name names, then I also have to talk about what I agree with and what I don't agree with. And then we run the thin line about defamation.
Yeah.
Or cult of
personality.
But yes. For example, and some of them are obvious. For example, in the movement from Snake to the Panther Party. You've heard about the cadre from Huey and Eldridge. You have not heard about the cadre who moved from Snake to the Panther Party with Kwame. You ain't heard of Ethel Minor, Coco Farrell, Bill Hall, Sekou Neblet, David Brothers, Lamin Jong-ha, Evelyn Monroe, Paul Monroe. You ain't heard of them. Partly because they have wanted us out of our history and we have not been self-promoting. I don't want to do that. I don't need to promote myself. I've done perfectly good 50 years with no interview. I don't need none now. In fact, it puts the spotlight on you. It puts the target on your chest. When you go too far, too fast with this enemy in front of us, it can be used for good. We've seen how it has been used for bad. This media is a weapon. It can be used for good, it can be used for bad. For the most part, it has been used for bad. But yes, and one way to look at history is to look at the lion struggle, how the Bible and the Quran has been interpreted historically. It's the reason why you have so many denominations, so many sects, so many churches. The history of the Lutheran and Protestant churches and their disagreements with the Catholic Church theologically produced these divisions. So too in the movement. So if you chase the genealogy of the lion struggle, of how history is interpreted, Let me give you one. How can you have a fifth pack in 1945 and a sixth pack in 1974? Dawg. You mean to tell me there were no meetings in 30 years?
Nkrumah had 2 in 58, right?
Thank you.
And there are others.
In Africa and the World, and in Du Bois's biography, he says the All-African People's Conference of 1958 was the real six-pack. He ignores the Afro-Asian People Solidarity Organization, which met in December '57 in Egypt. They ignore the Tricontinental Conference of '66 and '67 in Olas, which Mary Bembaka, Amilcar Cabral, Sekou Touré, Kwame Touré were part of. So what you do is you wait 30 years out of the struggle. Why would you say six-pack and not 9th or 10th UNI? That history, that tradition has nothing to do with us. How can you invite me to come to a meeting that wipes out my history? I inherit and continue the work of Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Touré, and Kwame Touré. Yes, Sekou Touré spoke at six-pack, but it could never have been held while Nkrumah was alive. And that's why we didn't go to it.
He would have been invited if you had it.
It couldn't have been held because he'd have busted the area out. If you read the struggles inside of the OAU, if you read the struggles over where the African Liberation Committee should be held, if you read the struggles over federalism versus, regionalism and incremental unity, there were fierce struggles. Couldn't have been held. Couldn't have been held. Kwame told C.L.R. James it ain't gonna work because Nyerere would compromise, and he did. He banned the Caribbean, the nationalist force in the Caribbean, on the request of the reactionary Caribbean governments. I don't blame him. That's what governments do. You couldn't have a nationalist meeting in Moscow or China. They wouldn't give you visas to get in. You can't have no serious meeting in the United States. You wouldn't get visas to get in. So Nyerere made a move for his survival. But it meant the nationalists and opposition forces in the Caribbean who built six-pack. It wasn't built in the United States, it was built in the Caribbean. And we're going to document that. They propped C.L.R. James up. They moved him. They fed him all around the world. And they could not go to their own conference. And he had a choice.
James said he's not going.
He didn't go. Because if he had went, he'd have lost respect and lost his base in the Caribbean. We still try to work with those forces who exist. We would not insult them by praising a six-pack.
So would you say the nation state adheres to that same dialectic too? Sometimes good, sometimes bad, or is it?
Yeah, everything does. I'm sometimes good, I'm sometimes bad.
So what do you do with the nation state now? I mean, it seems like it's always bad now.
I don't accept the Marxist notion of the withering away of the state.
Okay.
I don't accept the Stalinist definition of a nation.
Uh-huh.
So I'm not sure what we're talking about when we say nation state. Nkrumah proposed a definition of nation fundamentally and diametrically in opposition to the Stalinists.
Uh-huh.
Just put them side by side and look word by word. I'm not an anarchist. There must be be some way that people organize themselves, govern themselves, produce their spiritual, cultural, intellectual, material needs. I don't have the luxury to discuss or to think what that will be, because it's not going to come in my lifetime.
So we struggle with what exists.
No, I struggle to transform what exists with what I have at my disposal.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean.
I must understand my mission within my lifetime, my generation's lifetime. And that is not, my mission is not to build a new society. I can dream about it. I can discuss it, I can argue over it, but that's not my mission. My mission is to fight, to educate, and organize the people who then, new generations, will fight to achieve that. I think we get confused about our mission. But Black Power, read the book. 67, and if you read the other speeches and writings, you will see Kwame's perspective was clear. He did not view MFDP as the Mississippi Democratic Party. He didn't go all the way to say it was totally independent, but then when it was clear that it wasn't independent, he resigned. He went to build independent political parties in Alabama. When the White House sent the federal registrars down to sabotage that, and when Hosea Williams took money from Attorney General Dick Flower to finance Martin Luther King to run through Alabama, 10 counties saying, don't vote for a black candidate, don't vote for a black party. Hassan Jeffries got it in his book. I didn't say it, he wrote it. Martin Luther King said that. The Nation of Islam supported it. The Nation of Islam in Muhammad Speaks endorsed the concept of independent political party and sent money. The gang kids in Chicago rolled down. Fred Hampton, he wasn't the first one organizing the gangs. We can take that back generations, We can certainly date it back to 65, when Muhammad Ali took him to save his day. When Martin Luther King came to Chicago and tried to enlisted the gangs into the Chicago Freedom Movement. Not the fact that they were already there before he came. And when you look at Kwame Ture's trips to Chicago, look at his bodyguards. I remember one time he got off an airplane in O'Hare Airport. He saw 4 or 5 rival gangs and 2 or 3 good cop, bad cop. And he saw all them with guns and blah, blah, blah. He turned around and was getting ready to run back up that platform. He didn't see me. I'm jumping up and down, Kwame, Kwame, Kwame. So he got his little Rocky Balboa, came down there, went over there, picked me up, whispered in my ear, who is all these brothers? I said, they're your bodyguards. He said, next time bring women. That's what he said. Then he now proceeds to cuss me out loudly. Come on, come on. Now his ass was going back up the plane. But now all of a sudden, he Rocky Balboa. He ready to roll. And we rolled down the highway, 4 cars abreast with guns in 68. March of 68, before the Panther Party was really built in Chicago.
Real quickly, we wanted to also capture, if you can, how you came to know Kwame Ture and how you two grew close to each other.
Well, that's good and bad too.
Sure.
Kwame came to Chicago July 28th, 1966. He had been there before. raising money for Lowndes County, raising money for Mississippi. He had been there before. But within a few weeks after he said Black Power, again, not the first time, in Mississippi, he did a world tour. He wound up in Chicago. He was in Chicago for 2-3 reasons. One, he was there to raise money to help finance the struggle in Lowndes County and SNCC, because that's how he made his money. This myth that the money dried up after he said Black Power is a lie. This myth that it dried up after SNCC came out in support of the Palestinians is a lie. First of all, the SNCC's budget was $11,000, $15,000 in 1961, $10,000 from Harry Belafonte to do voter registration, $5,000 from Carl and Ann Brayton. By '64, the budget for SNCC was $800,000, but all the other projects had millions. I don't have the full figure yet, but the budget for the Mississippi Freedom Summer had to be $3, $4, $5 million. I was at the Library of Congress all day trying to get into Jim Former's papers so I can find the budget. I know how to do budgets. I know where money comes from. That money came into Mississippi because Johnson and the labor union and the churches brought it there to register people to vote for the election. And they had enough sense to know that they wouldn't get it in '64, they'd have it by '68. They're not that dumb. The money dried up the day after the presidential election of November '64. Because it was no longer needed. The campaign was over. And you will see the drop in the money from '64 to '65 to '66 before he was elected. This myth that we had no money is also a lie. The sources of money simply changed. Yes, the amount of money, but the sources.
So he's in Chicago.
He was all over. You got to get the FBI reports and the SNCC reports and the media to see how much he moved. I can't figure out how many times he came to Chicago in '68. He came. I'm organizing the speaking engagements. He also came because Mary McCabe was performing at Mr. Kelly's. It's like he almost moved there. And I don't remember. From March of '68 through November of '68. He must have been there 4 or 5 times. And every time he came, we had thousands in rallies and thousands in collection plates. When I first met him in '66, we cussed him out for going to the University of Chicago to speak to white folks before he spoke to us. It's recorded. They were paying him a couple grand. Yes, white folks ruled. The Democratic Party, the Zionist money pulled out, but the white campuses, the white schools, kept us alive. I know because I booked speaking engagements. I know which campuses.
What we're going to be doing this evening is trying
which teachers would bring us on the campus and which teachers would snitch on us after they did. I know what student groups would bring us onto the campuses and which ones would not. They don't count that. And that money came with no strings. If you wasn't boycotted, if you wasn't sabotaged, if you got on the campus, if you got the check, wasn't no strings. The fight was to get on the campus, to get the crowd, and to get the check. Once you achieved that, it was no strings. That died when he died. Because there was nobody else in our organization who had that charisma, that whatever you want to call it, that base of support. And we wasn't about creating no Kwame Therese. Other people are trying to create that. We weren't.
Bob, thank you. We're going to have to cut it short.
Thank you.